Okay, we're going to do a quick review of the Sadducees and Zealots, and then the key information about the Pharisees. So the Sadducees, they were, out of order, they were mostly priests and followers of the powerful Sadducee high priest. And so as priests, they were in control of the temple, and they ran the temple worship. That also was a source of wealth because people brought all sorts of, they brought money and gifts to the temple. So the Sadducees were wealthy, and sometimes they were definitely corrupt. There are definitely stories of Sadducees buying, bribing authorities and buying offices and stuff like that. They also were connected to the Roman authorities as the sort of elite, powerful group in Jewish society, and they also were more interested in Greek culture, in Greek thought, in Greek athletics, and in various other elements. Okay, now the key sort of belief. The Pharisees were busy developing the oral Torah. The Sadducees rejected that whole notion. They were committed to just following the written Torah in a very literal way. They also, as priests, they really valued temple rituals far above other aspects of tradition. They really, believed and argued that really all of Jewish religious life needed to focus on attending and supporting temple rituals. They also were they were really main rivals to the Pharisees, and they did everything they could to exclude Pharisees from communal leadership, whether that's involvement in the temple or in the Sanhedrin, the high court. So that's kind of the key beliefs in terms of what we need to know. In terms of the Great Revolt, they strongly opposed it. It's obvious why. They had the most to lose, both in terms of the temple itself and their own status, and the least to gain. Now, there's no trace of them after the destruction. That could be because they were, as priests, they were killed when the temple was destroyed. Or it could be just that once there was no temple and once the wealth of the Jews in Jerusalem had gone up in flames, there wasn't any meaning to being a Sadducee anymore, and they just sort of blended in with the other Jews. But as a group, they disappeared once after the destruction. Okay, so that's the Sadducees. Zealots. They were a political movement. It was a response to Roman oppression. They were really focused on overthrowing the Romans. They started with kind of terrorism and small acts of resistance, and ultimately they led the revolt when it started. Their numbers grew over time. It started in the first decade of the new era, and then their numbers grew with the outrage about Caligula threatening to destroy the temple, and then they grew massively when Florus, in 66, the Roman emperor in 66, stole all the silver from the temple, and that was really when revolt broke out in full force. Now the Zealots were really about ideology. Right? They were outraged when Romans brought idols to Jerusalem. They were really fierce, sort of patriots of Jewish belief. They believed deeply that Jews were unique. They were chosen. They were special, and that belief in the Jewish specialness led them to believe that since Judaism was the true religion, that if they rose up and battled Roman oppression, God would step in and literally help them, and God's hand would smite their enemies, despite the incredible power of the Roman army. And this was not just them. They got a lot of support because this idea that the end of times was coming, that the time of the coming of the Messiah was coming soon, this was the era, the 100, 200 years leading up to this, was the era when that idea had really gained widespread support. People really, they wanted to believe, they really bought into this idea. Jesus is another example. Jesus lived at around the same time. He died in 34 CE, so right in this period. And he was seen as a Messiah figure. The revolt, they led the revolt, of course. They tried to get others to participate. I mentioned the defeated commanders from the Galilee fled to Jerusalem, sort of filling out their numbers and also insisting on continuing the resistance. Obviously, they were the warriors. When they were killed when Jerusalem fell. The group that held them out at Masada for 3 years were not people who ran away from the fighting. They were a group that escaped once Jerusalem fell. So that's our zealots. Now, finally, the Pharisees. The Pharisees were sort of simpler, more common folk, and they were certainly very different than the Sadducees, who were wealthy and removed. They also saw the Sadducees as their main kind of rivals for leadership and influence in Jerusalem. Pharisees were scholars and interpreters of Torah. They not only read the Torah, but they really developed this idea of finding new meanings in it, what we call oral Torah. So they developed the oral Torah. They taught that God can be worshipped either inside or outside the temple. And part of the reason that they invested in that idea is that the Sadducees were controlling the temple service, which meant that the Pharisees were, in a sense, excluded from being involved in or participating in that. And also the Pharisees, who saw the Sadducees as misguided and corrupt, were horrified at how the temple was being run. So the idea that it was possible to serve God and connect to God even outside the temple was very appealing. They were suspicious of Hellenism. They saw it as corrupting. They hated the Romans and Roman power over the Jews, and they were anxious to see it weakened or removed. Now, in terms of the Great Revolt, the Pharisees were divided about it. There were some who really believed, like the Zealots, that God would lead them to victory and joined and even led the revolt. Others didn't, and others didn't want to be involved in fighting or didn't believe in this battle. One great example is Josephus, the historian, who later wrote the history of this war. He was a Pharisee, and the first thing we learn about him is that he was a commander of a rebel legion. He had joined up with the Zealots. It was only after his legion was defeated and he was captured that he came to believe, as he says, that the revolt was a disaster, and he worked to end it and tried and hoped to end it with a minimum of destruction and casualties. It seems that it didn't go so well. But he certainly says that that's what he believed. And finally, a small group of Pharisees escaped Jerusalem and tried to start over without Jerusalem, without the temple. And that's the group that took the name of rabbis. So what we know now about the Pharisees, their role in Jerusalem and their tensions with the Sadducees and the Zealots, their ideas about the temple and worship outside the temple are then backdrop for our understanding of who the rabbis were and what they were trying to accomplish in the years after this.